Is it really trying to get rid of things, or what's going on there? But we know that IgA wasn't doing what we thought it was doing for a long time. And this is just a cladogram to show, and these are the, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, or at least I wasn't when we first started this. These are some of the evolutionary biologists that I work with. Michael Lawrence, very well known. He can manipulate mesquite like your grandma can manipulate knitting needles. He's very good. But you can see that the appendix shown here in red pops up a lot over in the primates, as well as a lot of the rodents. If any given family, it's about a 50-50 chance that it'll have an appendix. And Darwin just didn't know this stuff. That's why he proposed what he proposed. It just, the work hadn't been done. It also pops up a couple of times in a certain group of the marsupials. And if you look at the kangaroo, in fact, it probably has a vestige of an appendix, which is interesting. So again, that's the last slide I have on that. And I think it's an important lesson to learn what's going on with the immune system and how it's interacting with bacteria. And the thing that clued us in first was, thought, my God, why have the bacteria just mutated? This is such an antagonistic interaction. In fact, we saw a tremendous amount of evidence for synergy. We looked at mutations in humans, and when the human lost the ability to interact with certain receptors on the bacteria tended to downregulate those receptors in that human. So it made a lot of sense that there was some kind of positive, mutually beneficial interaction going on between the immune system and the bacteria. And there's alternate explanations, but we've come at it from many different angles, and it all points in the same direction. So next we'll take a look at the mutualistic helminths. And so again, we're trying to look at what it takes to keep our immune system balanced, and sort of give you an overall idea, coming at two different angles of how we think this all fits together. So you have the microbiome on the one hand. We know that there's certain interactions between the immune system and the microbiome, and there's certain interactions back from the microbiome to the immune system. This has been very well studied. People are particularly interested in it. There's a major project out by the NIH now looking at the microbiome, because this interaction has gone bad in a lot of people. Inflammatory bowel diseases are causing a lot of problems. If you destabilize this with antibiotics, you can just simply fail to recover at all for a lot of patients. And again, I think we can look at humans as a model for what if we did this in say a vole, or a kangaroo, or what have you. The idea is, and I'm not going to go into the history of how this was figured out, except briefly. The idea is that there's other organisms out there, like helminths, which are disrupted by, their life cycles are disrupted by having water treatment facilities, having toilets, in large part, that are also very important in this overall scheme. And we're not putting in viruses in here, we're not putting in amoebas, we're not putting in protozoa. We're more interested in things that you could probably take out the helminths and replace that with something else that was more pathologic, that was more infectious or dangerous. We're really interested in how to get it back to normal for us, for quality of life issues. Everything from lupus to probably autism to food allergies to enterocolitis to inflammatory bowel disease to type 1 diabetes to Graves' disease, just probably chronic fatigue syndrome. These things are all probably, and everybody in here probably knows somebody who suffers or has children that suffer from some of these things. So the idea is, if you eliminate these, you still have your microbiome and you still have your immune system, but you leave those in a very precarious balance, a very dangerous balance that we're sort of suffering from at the present time. Another way to look at this is that to get these hyperimmune associated diseases, we're looking at different inflammatory diseases, and I'll show you a slide in a minute. The key characteristic is it's an emergent disease in post-industrial society. Okay, so lupus, MS, these things count. We're not interested in emerging diseases in the developing world. So it's a different ball game, but it turns out that we have to, if we want to solve the puzzle to some extent, we need to, or it's helpful to know a little bit about what an immune system looks like under normal circumstances. That is, under circumstances not in post-industrial society, under circumstances in which the human being has evolved. The idea is that you've got immune hypersensitivity, and some of you may recognize this old hygiene hypothesis idea. This is a refinement of that. We know that we have biome depletion, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how biome depletion enhances what the immune system does. It basically makes it hyperactive. You combine that with a couple of other things, genetic predisposition and certain kinds of triggers to get the hyperimmune-associated disease. Again, I gave you a whole list of them. I'll show you a few more here. Generally, all of these emerging diseases of Western culture, post-industrial culture, can be divided into two categories, which are not necessarily, it's not a good division. For example, coronary artery disease probably has a lot to do with a hyperactive immune system. But by and large, these things over here are correlated with activity most closely, or lack thereof of activity, no exercise, poor diet, whereas these things over here tend to be out of the individual's control completely. So this category here is the one that we're really interested in. Appendicitis, British epidemiologists first figured out that was one of those diseases that you don't find in developing countries. And sometimes there's a lot of controversy about this, and sometimes there's not. I put this in here. It's hard to track diseases in developing countries. It's hard to know exactly what the nature of those diseases are. But what work has been done indicates that these hyperimmune-associated diseases are not found in those developing countries. I know the data on a couple of these really well. I'm not an epidemiologist that studies this in general. Sometimes the experiment has to be done. For example, there was years of debate about multiple sclerosis until I'll show you some data later if we have time. Somebody added helminths back into some patients with MS, and their MS stopped progressing. So it was the first known cure for MS. So these are all things that are confirmed either by experiments in animal models or some of them in humans. There's some things that are very likely or very probable, and then some things that are very suspicious. I'm particularly interested in autism, because in that case, it may be that prevention is the only way to go. So we're looking at ways to sort of re-inoculate the human population to keep their immune system stable. Just a little bit of a crazy idea to some people. I'll go ahead and I think I'll just show you a couple of these slides. Why did it take so long to figure this out? When they've sort of known these diseases were emerging since the 1940s. And this is Graham Rook, a clinician scientist in London, I think I mentioned before, has done a lot of seminal thinking on this issue. If you take a look at autoimmune diseases and allergies, for example, you had one group of clinicians studying autoimmune diseases, another studying allergies. One was associated with Th1, so-called a certain kind of immune response. The other was Th2, a different kind. So they came up with the idea, okay, in post-industrial society, there's some problem with a regulation between Th1 and Th2, and that must be it. And that turns out, it makes sense in hindsight, although Graham Rook thinks it's crazy, but if you think back, I mean, I could see how everybody thought that way. It's just not the case, because the same factors bring back into line both the allergies and the autoimmune diseases. So we know from experiment that it's just not right. Let's see, we'll go ahead and skip that one and just go to this. I'll take a look at autism in this particular case. Modern medicine is very focused on the here and now. We don't look back at, we don't realize, okay, once the toilet comes in, or running hot water specifically so you can wash your hands after going to the toilet, it can take 10 to 20 years for that to clear out. It might not even matter if the helminths are cleared out in you. It may matter what your mother's status was when you were born or breastfeeding, or it may matter what your grandmother's status was when your mother was born or breastfeeding. There's epigenetic effects as well. So things are disconnected in time in terms of the stimulant. If everybody got a toilet and then the next day got sick, then toilets wouldn't be very popular. That's just not how it goes. So if you look at autism here, this is total grants, both private and federal, and it's pretty recent data, 2009, last time it was compiled. And you see that about 100 million, I bet 314 goes to cause and prevention. A lot of that is good. The problem is so huge, they're trying to help parents especially who are struggling with children that have autism. But $0 if really taken into account the idea that this is an emerging disease in post-industrial society and it's probably related to all these other things. Okay, it's just not really on the table for, we've already talked about that a little bit. And briefly, I'll talk to you about what's going on with the human disease. We can look at environmental stimulus. In the case of type 1 diabetes, for example, they found that the genotype of the cow that produces the milk you drink is a strong, strong indicator of whether or not you might have a child who has type 1 diabetes. And that's some brilliant work. There's a certain protein in the milk that's very important. Some cows make it and some cows don't. But in general, it's very, very hard to avoid those environmental stimuli. So if you're a clinician, this is a hard battle to fight. This is the strongest man in the world right here. One of kind. Just don't wrestle with this guy. And genetic or epigenetic factors are even worse. Because even if you discover what genes are important, what are you going to do about it? That's the point there. I mean, you can stop people from reproducing, or therapies aimed at the genetic underpinning of disease have been woefully unsuccessful. This is, at least the Americans know who this guy is. He's an advertising fella. He's very soft and fluffy. It's used by the media in the United States. This turns out to be a pretty soft underbelly for getting to the pathology. And of course, we don't really look at him. In modern medicine, we're trying to treat symptoms by and large. These two things are just too hard to get at. Especially for a lot of the autoimmune diseases, there's a viral trigger, and there's almost nothing you can do to avoid all viruses. This is a lot of studies have been done in rodents. It's just an example, and I can give you some references on this if you're interested. We just published a review covering most of what I'm going to talk about today. So the MS study, I'll just show that really quickly, that if patients were in Argentina, they had a huge cohort of people with MS. If they accidentally got colonized, and it did not matter with which helmet they got colonized. If they got colonized, and we don't use the word infected, right? That applies value to the relationship. So if they got colonized and they didn't have any symptoms that were pathologic from the colonization, then the progression of the disease is progressive recurrent multiple sclerosis, which you get an episode and it leaves you more debilitated than you were before. And it keeps getting worse in normal patients. These are just some control patients that were enrolled in the study at the same time. So we'll go ahead and skip the business about the inflammatory bowel disease, but it works in humans. This is sort of one of the ways in which the helminths work. There's evidence of a long history of evolutionary battle where the helminths are producing a lot of, these are all proteins secreted by a helminth that lives inside a human being, and each one of these proteins, especially the one circle, we actually know what the mechanism is. They're immunosuppressive agents. So the helminth produces an immunosuppressive agent, and the host ramps up the immune response. So over a period of at least 100 million years, probably about 300 million years, there's been this arms race, and if you suddenly take away these guys, then you're left with an army that has nothing to do. I know, it's an analogy. It's an analogy. Okay. Let's see, we'll go back to that, and just thinking about it clinically, we probably want to not just think about the helminths. There's other things.